When Trenton, Lucia, and I first sat down to discuss how we wanted to approach this debate, at first I thought I had a great solution that I proposed to them. I said, we don't need to write speeches, we'll just bring milkshakes in and throw them at the opposition. But then Trenton said to me, Alex, you're an idiot. There's many reasons that we're not going to do that. Those reasons are, it's not going to convince the opponents, it's just some cold dairy. It's not going to convince the audience, it's probably going to make them think you don't have anything very serious to say. And it's also just kind of morally wrong, because we're having a free discussion at the moment, and that's valuable. And for me to throw things at you or, purport any kind of violence against you is wrong. And you also all look, may I say, very lovely tonight, and it would be a shame to ruin your lovely outfits. So, I'm going to rebut a lot of what we just heard from Imogen. I'm then going to bring you 3 main points about how this destroys the very fabric of our society. I'm going to explain how it creates an atmosphere of fear, how it normalizes all forms of violence, and how it also shifts the political landscape and creates the very leaders and the very schemes that they are so against, and makes violence in general much more likely. Okay, so rebuttal. So we were all, I hate to say it, a little disappointed, because we know Oxford isn't as good as University as Cambridge, we had heard, but we did think that you got critical listening skills, and while Imogen brought a lot of great substantive, we're concerned that they didn't seem to hear most of what Trenton said. So just to remind you, in case some of you are also from Oxford and have also forgotten what Trenton said, Trenton told you lots of principled reasons about why violence is always wrong that have basically been ignored. He also told you that this debate is not about faux democracies, it's not about Jim Crow America, which was not democratic, it's not about modern-day Hong Kong, it's about actual democracies and the actual choices that are presented to people in those situations. No, thank you. Okay. Also, we hear this stuff about the Ferguson riots, and to be honest, obviously we have a lot of sympathy for that, but we think that the way you've analyzed that case is just not accurate of how it presented. We think that in fact, rather than making people see some Black Lives Matter as the reasonable Black Lives Matter people, instead we think that the whole movement was tainted, and that at least for the average viewer in America, they all seemed unreasonable. Whether or not that was actually the case, that is the way the media presented that, and that is the way that the perception of that movement has changed going forward. We also think that it led to more of the kinds of violence that you are trying to present. Because when you take average people in the suburbs of America, and in your own description, militarized police, it's quite clear which of those is going to benefit. We think that the violence that generally gets propagated is not violence against the state, but in general, it's just further oppression and further crushing of people. And obviously, that's not something we're going to support. No. Great. Thirdly, on this, we think a massive misconception in the case we've heard so far is that Imogen has only really addressed, the virtuous cases when, people report violence for causes that Imogen supports, like environmentalism or feminism. And we think that's great, but firstly, I'm going to explain to you in the majority of my speech why the virtuous cases, why virtuous groups using violence inherently leads to wicked groups using violence. And I'm also going to explain to you, no thank you, actually I'm just going to say it now, we think that it's incredibly subjective to say that some groups are good and some groups are bad, why we might all in this room have our own opinions about which groups are good and which groups are bad. There is no one way to designate those groups, and it is not okay to say that some groups can use violence and others cannot. If you wish to refute my partner's material, you need to explain why violence is okay in all cases. Fourthly, so you say that if you can prove a single exception, then you've won this debate. We think that's not true for 2 reasons. Firstly, Trenton already told you why there are principled reasons that there are no exceptions and that violence is always wrong, and you need to engage with that principle or you've forfeited the debate. But secondly, we also tell you that society is constructed on general rules, and when we discuss how a society should be formed, we discuss what kinds of rules we want to run our society under. While there may be some specific cases where violence is okay, and we would dispute that, unless you can describe general rules to build the society under, your case has no principled, it's just a wish list of what you would like in. No, thank you. Okay, sorry, moving on to my substantive. Okay, so firstly, I'd just like to clarify something. I'd like to explain why violence spreads. I'd like to explain why when, maybe anti-fascists use violence, that will inherently lead to fascists using violence. We think this is true for 3 reasons. Firstly, people copy their opponents, right? Like, you want to keep up with your opponents. So, you want an equal playing field. You want the media attention, which always goes to the more radical cases. So you're much more likely, if your opponents start using violence and, using vandalism or riots, to copy those techniques in order to seem like you're keeping up and to maintain control of the political sphere. You also want to seem that you are equally passionate about your case. Secondly, they are quite literally your opponents, right? Like, it's natural to respond with force. If anti-fa turns up with, flaming torches, then, obviously fascists are going to respond. We think that, often these clashes are very physical in nature, and so if one side brings violence happens on both sides, you have to defend that. Thirdly, we think that it is specifically the worst groups in society and the groups that you do not want to defend, which are most likely to increase their use of violence, right? Because we think that, however you might describe bad people, we all agree that bad people are more likely to use violence. So whoever you don't want to be using violence is most likely to be doing it, right? We also think it's a specific part of certain ideologies. We see that, for example, fascism is much, much happier to use violence against groups than, environmentalism. So while there may be slight increases in the, rates of violent protest used by certain groups that I might consider virtuous, we think the overall trend is that the groups that all of us would condemn are most likely to be the ones using the most violence. So with that in mind, let's discuss how this destroys the very fabric of our society. My time has gone off. All right. No. Firstly, on increased fear. So we think that in general, if more violence is used in a society, people are generally more afraid, right? The principle of a democracy is that very little violence is used. If any, where it is used, it's responded to by the police and hopefully stopped. We think that when you say, no, that's not the case, violence is sometimes okay, if Imogen, Dom, and Adam say so, we think that, people become a lot more afraid to go about their daily life, right? We see that, violence happens anywhere because people like to use innocent bystanders in their cases. We also see that, different groups have different things that they disagree with, right? If I want to go to a BP careers event at Cambridge, you might call me a corporate sellout, but you probably don't think I should be attacked. And there literally were violent protests at a BP careers event in Cambridge earlier this week. But we also see that because there are so many different groups with so many different ideologies, any one of us could fall into the group that a different group thinks it's valid to use violence against, right? And are you happy to take that risk? I know that I'm not. I don't want anybody to use violence against me, full stop. I don't want anybody to use violence against the people I love. We think that when you destroy that very principle that's the founding principle of our democracy, you make our society intrinsically worse, and you also make people more afraid to go about their daily lives. But worse than that, we think that you also just increase the amount of violence in general because you're normalizing violence, right? Because when we accept the principle that violence is okay if the cause that you're trying to pursue is okay, we see that you're approving of the violence, and so instead of addressing that violence, you look past that and you look at the motivations of the people who are using violence. You look at the cause they're trying to use, so you completely overlook the most crucial part. We see that this is already happening in America, right? The fact that there are school shootings means that violence has become normalized. It's on the TV screens, and people now rather than being shocked by that anymore, we're oh, okay, what was his reason this time? Why was this particular place blown up? And we think that in general, it integrates violence into society, and it shifts the discussion past the violence itself to a whole realm of other things. When we, on side propositions, say that violence is inherently bad and it should always be an important part of the discussion. But worse than that, we also see that this destroys politics because it shifts the center of politics as well. It normalizes violence within politics, and it lifts up candidates who use violent rhetoric and who have violent platforms. So we see that for the same reason that groups will also try to keep up by matching the violence of their opponents, political leaders will also do the same thing, right? They want to be seen as tough. You want to be seen that you care about the people you're representing. And we also see that we have ideals of strong leadership in our society, which mean, that people don't want to seem like they're just letting people walk all over them, right? And no thanks. And we think that this leads to leaders using violent rhetoric. But this also means that when they're elected, they take that violent rhetoric a step forward. Further, they implement the violent policies that they threatened, and they create more violence in society. We think that, for example, Trump's saying that, if we lose the election, we should all go out on the streets with our guns. We see that shifts the very center of what we consider normal rhetoric within politics, and it means that other politicians feel they have to keep up with that, otherwise they are seen as weak. It also means that the policies that a state implements are more violent. The things that you are most afraid of, i.e. the state using violence to oppress certain groups, are more and more likely when you elect leaders like Trump, like Modi, like Erdogan, right? This is the kind of thing that you are signing off on. Gandhi said, because I'm going to finish on a Gandhi quote, because, I'm a cliche and I'm a debater. Gandhi said, "I object to violence because when it appears to be good, the good it does is temporary, the evil done is permanent. We don't think you're doing any good, we think you're doing evil, we think that evil is permanent. Please vote side proposition."